The bowl shook in her hands, not from the weight, but from the fear. A Japanese woman stood in the shade of a barn, her eyes locked on a man who wasn't supposed to be talking to her. The sun burned down on the Texas dirt, but the air between them was even hotter, with tension, with rules not meant to be broken. He held out a plate, thick slices of peach cobbler still warm. She was not allowed to accept it, not from him, not from anyone not in uniform, and certainly not without permission. But he had said it softly, like a secret. No one has to know, it's just peaches. She hadn't tasted fruit since Nagasaki, and now here she was, a prisoner of war, barefoot, sunburned, staring down at something that felt more dangerous than any weapon. Kindness. And when she reached out and took it, the entire camp and everything she'd been taught began to unravel. The heat clung to her skin like a second punishment. Dust shimmered off the Texas dirt as she crouched in the shade behind the barn, the slice of peach cobbler still warm in her palm. The crust had crumbled slightly. Syrup had pooled in the curve of the bowl, catching the light like melted gold. She didn't eat it, not yet. Not because she didn't want to, but because she was terrified. The cowboy who had offered it to her had already walked away, whistling under his breath like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. No American soldier was supposed to give food to a Japanese prisoner without orders. No Japanese prisoner was supposed to accept it. She looked over her shoulder. No one was watching. But still, she felt the eyes of her ancestors, her mother, her brother, the weight of Bushido like a hand pressing down on the back of her neck. Honor was silence. Survival was shame. And yet her stomach twisted with need. She hadn't tasted fruit since before the firebombing. She remembered the smell of oranges, the sweetness of plums, but this was real, sticky, alive. She brought it to her mouth and paused. Her hands trembled. Not from fear of punishment, though that was real, but from the terror that this might taste like kindness, that it might taste good. She bit. The syrup hit her tongue first, thick, almost too sweet, a collision of sugar and spice and something warm that she couldn't name. Her mouth flooded with sensation, and for a moment her body betrayed her. Her knees nearly gave. She steadied herself against the barn wall and took another bite, smaller this time, slower. Trying to stretch the moment into forever. Her thoughts scrambled. What would the other women say if they saw? They had already warned her. Do not talk to them. Do not look them in the eye. Do not believe their gestures. She had believed them, until today. The cobbler was gone before she realized. Her fingers were sticky. Her shame bloomed slowly, like a bruise. She tucked the empty bowl into the shadows and wiped her hands on the hem of her dress. Stiff cotton, American-issued, still smelling of starch. Her heart thudded. Not from fear of being caught, but from what this meant. She had eaten the enemy's fruit. She had broken protocol. And nothing had happened. No lightning, no rifle, only warmth, only sweetness. She thought of her commanding officer back home, how he had looked them each in the eye before surrender, and said, "You will be tested. You must never give them your dignity." But what if dignity had nothing to do with defiance? What if it lived in the act of choosing? Choosing to eat, choosing to survive, choosing to taste again. Later that night, when the women lined up in the mess hall, she kept her eyes down. She couldn't look at the cowboy. She didn't want him to see the change. But she felt it, in the way her fingers twitched when she passed the dessert tray, in the way her mind drifted to the memory of crust and syrup and sun. That moment behind the barn had split something inside her, not shattered, just cracked, just enough for light to slip in. Across the room, the cowboy glanced up from a tray of dishes. He didn't nod, didn't smile, just met her eyes for a breath, then turned away, and she stood a little straighter. Not because she was proud, but because something fragile had been returned to her. Not freedom, not trust, just choice. And that, for now, was enough to carry. They had told her this would be the moment the enemy would exploit. That weakness would slip in through a smile, that a man in a hat could be more dangerous than any man with a gun. Back in Japan, they didn't say it outright, but it was in every lesson, every drill, every whispered warning from women whose eyes held more shadows than light. They warned about the men, the American men, who would wait for signs of softness. They would lure you with kindness, then shame you in ways words could not describe. She had believed it with the kind of bone-deep certainty only a starving girl raised under the war flag could. Until that bowl of peach cobbler burned a hole straight through the center of that belief. She was 16 when the training began. Girls too young for rifles, too stubborn for silence, were sent to military hospitals and logistics bases under the banner of service. They called them volunteer units, but no one had volunteered. The instructors told them they were the last wall between honor and humiliation. If captured, they must never cooperate, never speak unless ordered by Japanese command, and, above all, never allow themselves to be touched. "You are the Empire's daughters," one commander barked. "If you are taken, you must endure, or you must vanish." They were handed leaflets, American cartoons showing women dancing in jazz clubs and laughing with soldiers, and told they were weapons of distraction. "This," he said, holding up a photo of an American with a cigarette dangling from his lips, "is the face of a beast." Her brother, Takeshi, had echoed it just before he left for the front. They had crouched under a broken window during an air raid, and he had whispered, "If they ever catch you, don't listen to their voices. They'll smile while they burn your soul. Promise me." She had nodded. She remembered the way his hand tightened around hers, how he looked not like a soldier, but like a scared boy pretending to be brave. That was the last time she saw him, his uniform still hanging too loose on his frame, his boots worn to the sole. So when the cowboy handed her that peach cobbler, her instincts screamed that it was a trap, and yet nothing had happened. No leering, no cruelty, no punishment, just a man with sunburned arms and a quiet voice who said, "You looked hungry," as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. She'd studied his face when he turned, trying to find the mask, trying to find the wolf behind the cowboy hat. But there had been nothing predatory in him, no sneer, just a weariness, maybe even a sadness, that looked far too familiar. And that's what disturbed her most. She had expected brutality. She had trained for it, hardened herself against it, but she had not prepared for gentleness. Gentleness disarmed in ways violence never could. That night, lying on her cot with the wool blanket pulled to her chin, she tried to rebuild the walls. She listed every warning, every face of the girls who didn't return from the camps in the Pacific. But the sweetness lingered, not just in her mouth, but in her memory, and with it a question began to echo, quiet but relentless. What if they were wrong? The wind rustled through the slats of the barracks wall. Somewhere outside, a harmonica drifted on the air, notes soft and aimless. She closed her eyes and saw Takeshi's face again, his fear disguised as fury. "Don't listen to their voices," he had said. But now she wondered, what if he'd never heard one? Every inch of the camp was gridded like a map, bordered in fences, patrolled in silence, enforced by things that were never written but always known. The Geneva Convention, they said, protected her. The Americans did not beat them. They fed them, clothed them, kept them from freezing at night. There were medical checkups, clean sheets, and boots that didn't fall apart when they walked. But there were also rules, hard lines drawn not in ink, but in the air between prisoners and guards. Do not wander, do not speak unless spoken to, do not touch, and do not accept anything unless handed down from the chain of command. Even kindness, if it came from the wrong direction, was a violation. She learned this quickly. Everyone did. Wake before sunrise, line up, eat what was given, work if assigned, return to barracks, repeat. Women swept the walkways with stiff-backed posture, folded laundry with mechanical care, spoke in low tones, if at all. There was safety in obedience, safety in invisibility. Those who smiled too much, who lingered too long near the Americans, were met with looks, not from guards, but from the other women. Sharp glances, quiet muttering. Shame didn't need to be shouted here. It only needed a breath. She felt it the day after the cobbler. A girl from Nagano, older, with cracked hands and a permanent scowl, spotted her washing the empty bowl alone and said nothing. But she didn't need to. Her silence pressed against the air like a stone. The implication was clear. We saw you. You took something that was not yours. You let them see you as a woman, not a prisoner. And worse, you accepted it. Still, the Americans didn't punish her. No one spoke of the bowl, and that, somehow, was more unnerving than a scolding. It was as if the gesture didn't belong in the world of punishments and permissions. It simply happened. The cowboy who had given it to her passed by later that week near the stables. He didn't speak, just tipped his hat. Not a salute, not a command. Something in between. Her heart stuttered in her chest, not out of fear, but out of awareness. She returned the slightest nod. Nothing more. But it felt like crossing a river. He began appearing more often. Or perhaps she simply noticed him now, carrying sacks of feed, coiling rope, laughing with the other guards in that easy American way, like laughter wasn't something to ration. She started to recognize the cadence of his footsteps. The scrape of his boots on gravel was different, looser, less military. One day, while sweeping dust off the walkway outside the mess hall, she dropped the broom. It clattered loudly, drawing glances. Before she could kneel to pick it up, he was already there. He crouched, handed it back with one hand, and said, gently, "Careful now." Just that. Her fingers brushed his for a second. Just a second. But the warmth stayed long after he stood. She didn't thank him. She couldn't, but she didn't look away either. The rules said she should report the interaction. The rules said she should forget it. But she did neither. That night, she sat on the edge of her cot and stared at the knot in the wooden floorboard beneath her feet. The camp was quiet. Too quiet. The stillness made the smallest things loud, the memory of syrup on her lips, the weight of a broom in her hand. The feeling that the walls between right and wrong were thinner than she thought. The rules were written in steel, yes, but steel rusts, and something inside her had already begun to bend. He never spoke to her again, not directly. But he was always there, a presence at the edge of things. She noticed him now in ways she hadn't before. The way he tied a bandana around his neck when the sun climbed too high. How he wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, like a man raised in heat and hard work. He whistled while he moved, not songs she knew, but drifting melodies that felt like rivers, like roads. Never martial, never sharp, just sound, floating above chores, filling in the silence between commands and consequences. He didn't watch her. That was what confused her most. He never lingered, never leered, not like the men they'd been warned about. His glances were passing, his gestures efficient, but something in his manner suggested seeing, not just looking, seeing her, and that, in its own way, was more disarming than any compliment could have been. It was 3 days after the broom incident when she saw him again near the fence. The wire ran like a scar through the camp's perimeter, high, taut, topped with barbs that gleamed in the morning sun. On the other side was the orchard, rows of peach trees bent with late summer weight, their branches low and heavy, humming with bees. It didn't seem real. She hadn't seen fruit growing on trees since before the war. In Nagoya, the orchards had burned with everything else. He stood there in the shade of one of them, arms crossed, watching a horse graze near the fence. Then he reached up, casually, and plucked a peach from a branch. No ceremony, no tension, just a man having lunch. She was standing at a distance by the laundry line, pretending to untangle a sheet. But he must have seen her. He didn't wave, didn't nod. Instead, he turned, walked toward the post where the outer fencing met the narrow maintenance path, and set the peach down on the wood. Then he walked away. That was all. She didn't move at first. It could be a coincidence, a gesture meant for someone else, a trap. Her mind spun through every possibility, but something in the simplicity of the act, the casualness, made her breath hitch. This was not a gift, not a challenge. It was a question, one she would have to answer herself. The walk to the post felt longer than it was. Her feet felt loud on the dirt, her hands too visible at her sides. A fellow prisoner glanced at her from the water barrel but said nothing. No one stopped her. When she reached the post, the peach was still there, golden, sun-warmed, a bruise along one edge like a thumbprint. She looked through the fence. He was gone. She didn't take it. Not yet. Instead, she stood for a moment, staring at the wire. The fence had always been a barrier, a line between captivity and the world beyond. But now it looked different. It was still sharp, still real. But for the first time, it felt like something more, a question, a boundary not just of space, but of belief. What lived on the other side of this wire? Not just freedom, but contradiction, and maybe mercy. She reached out and took the peach. That night, she didn't eat it. She kept it hidden under her cot, wrapped in a handkerchief. Not out of guilt, but reverence. As if the softness of it might teach her something steel never could. She waited until the barracks had gone still, the blankets quieted, the breathing shallow and even. The moon hung behind a gauze of cloud, casting just enough light through the slats in the wall to see her hands as she reached beneath the cot. The handkerchief was still there, folded neatly, cradling the peach like it was sacred. Her fingers trembled as she unwrapped it. The fruit had softened further. A thin line of juice had bled into the cloth, sticky and gold. She cupped it in her palms like an offering, like something that could vanish if handled too harshly. Then, with no ceremony at all, she brought it to her mouth and bit. The skin split easily. The flesh inside was warm from the heat of the barn floor. It tasted of sunlight and sugar and rot, too ripe, almost fermented, but still real. Still fruit, still life. She closed her eyes and let it happen, bite after bite, each one messier than the last. Juice slid down her chin and along her fingers. She didn't wipe it away. She ate it all. When she reached the pit, she hesitated. It was smooth and slick in her mouth, a hard reminder of what remained when sweetness ended. She didn't know why, but she wrapped it back in the handkerchief and tucked it into her blouse, against her skin. She wiped her face with the edge of her sleeve and sat in silence, trembling. The flavor had carried her somewhere she hadn't been in years, back to her mother's kitchen in midsummer. A memory that rose uninvited. Screen doors, laughter through steam, the sharp clang of a knife on cutting board, and the scent of overripe plums left out too long. Her mother had scolded her once for sneaking fruit from the neighbor's fence. "They will know it was you," she'd whispered, but then smiled, slicing the peach anyway and handing her half. That day she had licked the syrup from her fingers and thought nothing of it. Now, in a foreign barn behind wire and rifle towers, she wept for it. Not from sweetness, from grief. The grief of remembering something whole while holding what was broken. The grief of being allowed to feel, even briefly, something like childhood again. She hadn't expected the taste to cut so deep. She hadn't expected the warmth of it to be cruel, because it was cruel. It was cruel to remember summer while living in aftermath. It was cruel to taste comfort in the hands of the enemy. It was cruel to cry over a piece of fruit while knowing her country still burned. Her people still starved. Her brother might be dead. And she had eaten an American peach. She curled onto her side, fists pressed to her mouth, rocking gently as if motion could soothe the storm inside. The floor was cold beneath her, but her chest burned. What had he done, really? He had left a piece of fruit. That was all. But it had unspooled everything. It had whispered to the parts of her that still wanted softness, that still believed life might be more than orders and hunger, and it had left her defenseless. She hated him for that, and she didn't know. When morning came, she didn't speak, didn't meet anyone's gaze, but she carried the pit in her pocket, small and hard, like a secret, like a wound, or maybe a seed. It happened in the wash line, where eyes were always watching even when mouths stayed shut. She had reached into her pocket without thinking, fingers brushing the smooth hardness hidden there, grounding herself in its weight. The girl beside her, thin, sharp-eyed, older by a few years, saw it. Just a glance, just a pause that lasted a fraction too long. But in camps like this, that was enough. By evening the whispers had begun. They did not accuse her outright. That would have required courage. Instead, they withdrew, bowed less deeply in her direction, shifted away on the benches. Silence became their punishment, colder than any rebuke. She understood it immediately. She had crossed a line not written on any sign. She had accepted something personal, something intimate. She had allowed herself to be seen. The peach pit stayed in her pocket anyway. 2 days later, a sergeant called her name, mispronounced, flattened into something almost unrecognizable. She stepped forward, posture stiff, eyes down, heart hammering. He asked a few questions in clipped phrases, his tone neither harsh nor kind. Did she receive food outside ration? Had anyone offered her anything inappropriate? She shook her head. The truth sat heavy on her tongue, but she did not release it. He studied her face for a long moment, as if weighing whether the effort was worth it. Then he waved her away. That was all. No punishment, no report, no warning, just indifference. And somehow that was worse, because once again nothing happened. The world did not collapse. The camp did not tighten around her throat. And in that absence of consequence, something inside her shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that she noticed it in the smallest ways. She stopped bowing quite so low, not out of defiance, simply because she forgot. Her spine remembered itself before her mind did. She began lifting her gaze when spoken to, meeting eyes for a heartbeat longer than required. Each time felt like stepping onto thin ice. Each time the ice held, The other women noticed. They watched her walk differently now, her shoulders less curved, her steps more certain. Some looked away quickly, as if afraid that whatever she carried might be contagious. Others stared with something like resentment. How dare she risk it? How dare she change? She felt the fracture growing inside her, the old voice still whispering obedience, endurance, silence, and a new one, quieter but persistent, asking why. Why must dignity look like erasure? Why must survival feel like shame? No commander had ever answered those questions, no pamphlet, no oath. One afternoon, while hauling linens near the infirmary, the cowboy passed her again. He nodded, as always, but this time she did something new. She said, "Thank you." The words were clumsy, broken. Her tongue stumbled over the sounds, the vowels unfamiliar, the consonants too hard. But they were words, English words, spoken out loud. The sound of them startled her more than it did him. He stopped, surprised, then smiled, not wide, not triumphant, just enough to acknowledge her effort. "You're welcome," he said, slow and careful. That night she practiced the phrase under her breath. "Thank you." The syllables tasted strange, but not unpleasant. Language, she realized, was another kind of border. And like the fence, it could be crossed, carefully, quietly. The whispers grew sharper after that. One woman muttered that she was forgetting herself. Another said she was becoming American. No one said her name anymore. But when she lay down at night, the pit warm in her palm, she felt something she hadn't felt since before the war. Not happiness, not peace, but direction, as if the path forward was no longer only endurance. They called her disobedient. She began to think that might not be the worst thing she could be. The sun was low that day, not yet evening, but soft enough to paint everything gold. The fences stretched like lines drawn by a steady hand, and beyond them the horses moved slowly, their tails flicking lazily against the late summer flies. She had finished her chores early. Her hands were still wet from rinsing the linens. When she looked up, he was there, by the west fence, where the slope dipped slightly toward the orchard. He wasn't looking at her. He was brushing a chestnut mare with long strokes, steady as breathing. She could have walked the other way, but she didn't. The air was quiet, that rare kind of silence that falls between the end of duty and the beginning of dusk. When he finally turned, his face didn't change much, just a soft squint into the light, a glance that neither summoned nor dismissed. He nodded toward the fence rail. "You ever sit up there?" he asked. She didn't answer, but her feet moved. She approached like she was stealing something. Not from him, from the camp, from the rules, from the version of herself that still lived in the eyes of the other women. She paused before climbing. Then, with a breath, she swung her leg up and perched on the fence. It was higher than she remembered. She hadn't been above ground level in years. Not since before the war, not since childhood, when she used to climb the wind-battered cherry trees near her village just to feel the breeze lift her hair. Up here, even just on the fence rail, the world looked different. Open, wide, as if possibility hadn't been completely crushed beneath boots and barbed wire. He said nothing. He just clicked his tongue, led the mare closer, and then— Impossibly, he offered, a gesture, palm upward, reins slack, the quiet suggestion of trust. She looked at the horse, then at him. "No ride," she said, her accent thick, her voice nearly lost to wind. But he smiled, not teasing, just patient, and gave the reins a gentle tug, coaxing the animal to stand still. "Just sit," he said. The saddle was warm. She climbed up with the grace of someone who had watched others do it but never tried herself. Her legs trembled, Not from fear, but from disbelief. The leather creaked beneath her weight. The horse shifted slightly, but didn't spook. She gripped the horn tightly. And then, for the first time in her memory, she wasn't looking up. She was looking down, not in dominance, not in pride, but in awe of the world as it could be seen from this new place. The barracks looked smaller. The fence no longer loomed. The air felt fuller. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, and let the wind carry the scent of hay and sweat and sun-dried earth. He never touched her, not once, not to steady, not to guide. He stood nearby, respectful, present, but not hovering. It was the first time a man had been that close without her having to shrink. That, more than the height, made her feel weightless. After a few minutes, she climbed down. Her knees were shaky. Her heart was not. She said nothing. Neither did he. But when she walked back toward the camp, dust rising around her ankles, something had changed in her gait. Not arrogance, not defiance, just a quiet elevation. A woman no longer fully underfoot. Behind her, the mare snorted and shook its mane, and the cowboy, arms folded, leaned against the fence, watching, not claiming. Letting her go. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like property. She felt like a person who had, even briefly, touched the sky. The pencil felt heavier than it should have. She turned it between her fingers, studying the worn yellow paint, the bite marks near the eraser where someone else had chewed it absent-mindedly. Paper, too. Real paper, thin but clean, handed out that morning with quiet instructions. Write home if you wish. Keep it brief. Names optional. Many women froze at the sight of it, staring as if the page might accuse them. Writing meant leaving a trace, a truth, a vulnerability that could travel farther than barbed wire. She did not write to Japan. She sat on the bench near the stable instead, paper folded once, then twice, then smoothed again. The camp hummed with low activity. Boots on gravel, distant voices, the creak of wood. The cowboy was nearby, mending a loose rail with methodical taps of his hammer. He didn't look up when she approached. That somehow made it easier. Names were dangerous. They had been taught that early. A name could lead back to a village, a mother, a sibling still alive. A name could invite questions, records, consequences. In the hospitals back home, they were called by numbers, by rank, by nothing at all. Individual identity dissolved into duty. It was safer that way. To be unnamed was to be protected. She had carried that belief across the ocean. Now she unfolded the paper. Carefully, deliberately, she wrote the characters she had traced 1,000 times as a child. Slow strokes, precise angles, her given name. Just that. No family name, no village, no apology. The pencil scratched softly, a sound so ordinary it felt radical. When she finished, she stared at it for a long moment. The ink looked fragile, alive. She folded the paper once and stood. He noticed her then. She held it out to him, palm open. He hesitated, eyes flicking to the paper, then to her face. There was no smile, no curiosity, only surprise, and then something quieter. Recognition, perhaps. He took it gently, as if it might tear. He read it, and then he stopped moving. The stillness was complete. The hammer lay forgotten in the dust. The wind stirred the grass. For a breath, or several, he said nothing at all. Not praise, not teasing, not even thanks. Just stood there, holding her name like a fragile thing entrusted to him. She waited for something to happen. Nothing did. Finally, he nodded once, slow, respectful, and folded the paper carefully, placing it inside the pocket of his shirt over his heart. He did not ask for more, did not say his own name, did not break the moment by filling it with words. That was when she understood the risk she had taken. This was more dangerous than the peach, more dangerous than the horse. Because food could be dismissed as hunger, height as curiosity. But a name was a declaration. It said, "I exist. I am not a shadow. I trust you with this piece of myself." And she had given it freely. She turned away before he could speak, her pulse loud in her ears. Every step back toward the barracks felt exposed. She expected whispers, accusations, a hand on her shoulder, but none came. The camp remained unchanged, and yet she knew irrevocably that she was not. That night she slept without clutching the pit. The next morning she woke to something unfamiliar, anticipation. She did not regret it. And if you are finding this story as powerful as we are, please like the video and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. But she also did not speak of it. The name she had given him remained a secret act, a breath she dared not repeat. Days passed. The sky brightened earlier now, the mornings warmer. Still, she didn't go back to the fence. Instead, she stayed near the bunkhouse, folding laundry with the other women, mending seams, nodding when spoken to, but offering nothing more. Yet something had shifted, not just within her, but around her. Her silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of obedience. It was the silence of knowing. That week, the guards handed out paper again. Mail day. Twice a month, the Red Cross coordinated letters home, censored and slow, but delivered. Most women left the pages blank, afraid of what truth would reach Japan. Others wrote mechanical pleasantries, health fine, food bearable, weather hot, then burned the pages before they could be collected. She had done both. This time, though, she did neither. She wrote, but not to send. The pencil hovered over the paper, unsure where to begin. Dear Mother felt too raw. To my family, too cold. She skipped the greeting entirely and began instead with a memory. There are peach trees here. She paused, looked out the window, then kept writing. They grow behind the fence. I am not supposed to eat them, but I did, just once. It was soft and sweet, and I cried like a fool after. She stopped. The graphite smudged slightly as her hand rested on the page. The words felt wrong, too personal, too foreign. Yet they came anyway. The man who gave it to me wore denim and a hat that made me laugh the first time I saw it. I never learned his rank. He never asked mine. A faint tremble passed through her fingers. He offered me something that tasted like freedom. She stared at the line. It was true, and it was unforgivable. The camp had trained them in more than survival. It had trained them to remember shame, to rehearse it, to cling to it like duty. Comfort was a trap, softness a betrayal. And still she could taste the peach, feel the horse beneath her, hear the sound of boots in the gravel as he walked away without asking for anything. She wrote more. About the way his eyes never lingered, about the silence they shared, and how sometimes that silence was kinder than words, about the name she gave him, and how he had folded it away like a promise. Then she stopped. The letter had no ending. She read it through once, hands sweating slightly. Then she tore it. One careful rip. Then another. Until the words were confetti in her lap. Not because they were untrue, but because they were too true, too complicated to explain to anyone who had never sat behind that fence, anyone who had not lived in a world where enemies offered fruit. She did not cry. She gathered the torn pieces and placed them inside her coat pocket. Later, she would scatter them in the latrine fire like all the others. But not yet. Not just yet. Because some part of her needed to carry them a little longer. Not the words, but the memory. The act of writing had marked something, not guilt, but clarity. She could not tell the story, but she could live with it, and so the letter remained unsent, but never truly gone. The paper had turned to ash, but not the memory. She carried it in her hands, in her spine, in the new steadiness of her breath. And in the quiet mornings that followed, she noticed something else. The post was empty. No peach, no cowboy, only the rusted wire humming in the wind and the leaves above shifting like they knew too much. Then, one afternoon, he returned. Not with a smile, not with a word, just with a peach. It was smaller this time, less perfect, a bit misshapen, with a line down one side like it had fallen against a stone, but he placed it on the post the same way, slow, deliberate, almost reverent. Then he walked off toward the stables without turning back. She stood a few yards away, rake in hand, heart still. This time she did not take it. Instead, she returned to the barracks, opened the small tin box where she kept what little was hers, a folded handkerchief, a safety pin, the stub of the pencil he'd once given her, and a single pit, polished smooth from weeks of turning it in her palm. She wrapped it in the cloth, and the next morning, before roll call, she slipped out early. The sun had barely touched the trees, the grass was cool beneath her feet, and the orchard was quiet. The peach still waited, but she didn't touch it. She reached into her pocket and placed the wrapped pit on the post beside it. The fabric was faded now, once white, now the color of old milk, but she tied it in a small knot so it wouldn't blow away. A parting, a reply, a thank you that language could never hold. She stood there for a moment longer, not hiding, not trembling, just standing. Then she turned back, silent, and rejoined the line before anyone noticed. By summer's end, orders came. Transfer, west, another camp, or maybe home. The rumors ran wild. Some would stay, some would disappear into holding stations. No one knew for sure, but she packed quickly and without hesitation. The night before she left, she walked past the fence one last time. The post was bare, no peach, no pit, just splinters and dust and the memory of something that had happened there. Not romance, not rebellion, but something harder to name. Recognition, dignity, a kind of truth. She didn't see him, not at the gate, not in the fields, and not when the trucks rolled out at dawn with canvas sides and rattling tires. But she looked anyway as the sun crested behind the trees, and for a brief second she thought she saw his hat, not near the wire, but by the stable doors, one hand resting on a horse's neck. She didn't wave. He didn't chase the truck. That wasn't their way. Some stories end not with declarations, but with silence, not with embraces, but with something left behind, a pit wrapped in cloth, a name written once, a fence post. Years later, she would marry, in the North, to a man who never fought. She would raise 2 children, hang laundry in the wind, and bake pies in late July when the peaches ripened. And always, always, she would slice one open, pause, and remember. Not his face, but the gesture, the stillness, the day she did not take the peach, and the morning she left something behind instead. If this story moved you, please like the video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. And thank you for keeping these memories alive.